Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Kate Eason from the Lytton Phil, and I'd like to welcome you to this talk, which, as you no doubt know, is part of our series of events celebrating the life and work of Dante. Over to you, Andrew.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to see so many people logged in. I particularly would like to introduce Keith because I have to thank him, because without Keith's blog posts earlier in the year about the centenary of Keats, Baudelaire and Dante, this whole Dante series would probably never have happened. It was a combination of that and seeing something on a YouTube channel. So Keith, thank you. Obviously, we know that Dante has had a huge influence in many areas of the arts, but particularly in visual arts. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing Keith's talk. So Keith, over to you.
Okay, so thank you, Andrew. The main purpose of the talk is to introduce you to the exhibition which Andrew has put on at Lytton Phil, and it looks absolutely stunning. So it does look incredible, and it has as a sort of high point the illustrations by John Flaxman, who we're going to talk about later on. I have no credentials at all as a Dante scholar. The one thing I can claim to be is that I'm following the footsteps of two very great poets. So T.S. Eliot and Sean O'Brien and myself, we all struggled through the Divine Comedy with much use of a dictionary. And so that's my credential. A secondary purpose, and I'm glad that Andrew mentioned this, is to publicise the posts which I've done on the Lytton Phil blog. So there are 3 blog posts on Dante, and Kay asked me to make sure that there was minimal overlap between those and this. So don't feel that you don't need to read them because you've been here, because it is all quite different stuff. So some introductions to Dante. So I'm going to recommend a few books here. Reading Dante from Here to Eternity by Prue Shaw. Wonderful, wonderful book. It's in the Lytton Phil Library. Prue Shaw, of course, is the long-suffering wife of Clive James, and she is a very, very eminent Dante scholar. And it's a beautifully written and incredibly learned book. The same applies really to the second one, so the very short introduction, which I've donated to the Lytton Phil. David Roby was in fact an Italian tutor while I was at Oxford 40 years ago, and he's very, very knowledgeable. I can also recommend Sean O'Brien's Inferno translation, very readable, really sort of makes a good story out of the whole thing. And perhaps slightly more offbeat, the cartoon version of Inferno by Hunt Emerson and Kevin Jackson. And you might think, well, how can a Dante cartoon be any good? And actually, Kevin Jackson very interestingly pointed out on a radio discussion a few months ago that there is quite a lot in common between Dante and cartoons, and we'll come back to that later on. And so the discussion I'm talking about was on Radio 3. You can find that on the Free Thinking Radio 3 sort of archive. So Sean was on that discussion as well as Kevin Jackson, who contributed the text to that cartoon book. It's a fascinating discussion, that, and I do recommend it. There's loads out there, lots of very great scholarship, of course. So, as I said, I'm going to look at things which, for me personally, brought Dante to life. And this is a personal selection to start with. So this is a photograph of a Divine Comedy reading, which took place in Ravenna in 2015. And the reader there read the second canto, which I particularly remember as being absolutely beautifully read. Behind her is the church of San Giovanni Evangelista, and this was the church where Dante himself worshipped while he was at Ravenna. He died there, of course, 700 years ago. So that was a great echo of Dante himself. To the left from my left, I'm sitting there in the audience. On my left was the centre for immigrants in Ravenna, and there were a number of sort of asylum seekers there, sort of standing watching us, perhaps looking rather puzzled at why we were sitting there. But it's a kind of reminder that for Ravenna, Dante is very much an exile, an asylum seeker, and they took him in, and they're obviously very proud of that. There was another great reminder of Dante on this particular evening, because the air was absolutely thick with mosquitoes, and of course it was a mosquito bite that killed Dante, and who knows, perhaps these mosquitoes were the descendants of that very one, who knows. We didn't actually last all the way through the Inferno, unfortunately, because it was a bit bitey. So by the time Dante died in 1321, he was already a celebrity. So the first two, the Inferno and the Purgatory, had become incredibly famous in his own lifetime. And he just seems to have just finished Paradiso before he died. And so immediately after he died, everyone wanted to claim him. And in particular, Florence, they desperately wanted his remains back, but they never got them. And of course, that's pretty fair in a way, because during his lifetime, if he had entered Florence, he would have been killed. He was sentenced to death. So that reader read in particular a beautiful passage in Canto 2 where Dante is appealing for help to the muses. And my Italian is terrible, but anyway, he said, "O muse, o alto ingegno, all my aiutate," he says, "O muses, O high genius, please help me." And it's sort of stressing both that this is the emotional low point of the story, when he's sort of cast down and looking for a way out. And also, I think, emphasizing the essentially literary character of the undertaking, that he's not, as any good Christian you might expect, he's not appealing to God for help, he's appealing to the muses. This is a literary undertaking. So another personal experience of mine was seeing this exhibition in Durham in 2017, and put on by Richard Gameson, who's the professor of the history of the book. Wonderful exhibition of manuscripts and early printed versions of the Divine Comedy. And from that, I learned that over 800 manuscripts survive, which is more than any other book except the Bible. And there is evidence that there were specialized workshops in Florence churning out cheap copies for working people. And there was a copy there in the exhibition which had belonged to a silk weaver. So it was an incredibly popular book. And that, of course, is reflected in the number of illustrations. So Botticello was not the first person to illustrate the Divine Comedy. He produced roughly 90 drawings over a period of a decade or more. And it's not entirely clear why he did it, whether, you know, is this a finished work? Was it going to go into a book? Are they preparatory studies? Was there a patron? Nobody knows the answers to these things. But what he has done is he's fixed in everyone's mind the image of Dante that we all know. So there he is with that sort of tall, gaunt appearance, the headdress and the nose, of course. And he derived that from a description by Botticelli. So, sorry, not Botticelli, Boccaccio. So Boccaccio had written a life, which is apparently highly unreliable. But anyway, Botticelli has fixed that image for all time, really. And there's another exhibit from that exhibition, which shows you how that image has become sort of iconic, horrible word, but anyway, you can't really avoid it in this context. And you can see there, of course, that he's crowned with the bay leaves, as he dreamed of being, crowned with laurel and returning to Florence in glory. So this, of course, is one of the very famous scenes in the Inferno, the punishment of those who deal in church offices, the simoniacs. And there they are, sort of head down in those fiery pits, including a pope, at least one pope in there. And of course, although Dante is doctrinally orthodox, he's a good Catholic, there is an awful lot of criticism of corrupt members of the clergy. And some of it very similar to the sort of things, of course, that Martin Luther would come out with a couple of hundred years later. And that was one of the reasons why the Divine Comedy was placed on the index of forbidden books. So roughly 200 years after his death, the Catholic Church decided to ban it. It took them a long time. And arguably, I mean, one of the arguments made in that exhibition was that there was a bit of a decline in the fortunes of the Divine Comedy during the Renaissance. It was perhaps seen as outmoded, sort of medieval in our terms. Perhaps it was a vulgarity in it. I mean, there is a great variety of language, including very sort of earthy language in there, which was not really to the taste of the Renaissance. However, it's worth pointing out that Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael were all great fans. And in a way, perhaps it's surprising that they didn't really pick up the baton from Botticelli and illustrate more of it. And again, going on the scholarship from that exhibition, it's said that in the 17th century, the Divine Comedy sort of reaches a bit of a low. There's a relatively small number of editions. And you can see this edition from 1613, they've even given it a different title. They've called La Visione, the vision, as if they're trying to sort of come and rebrand it, to use our modern expression. Of course, it's a reminder that this great book has no title. So he didn't give it a name himself. He simply refers to it as this comedy. He steps out, he kind of breaks the fourth wall, as the actors say. He speaks to us directly and he says, this comedy. The divine bit came much, much later. So that comes in the 18th century. So how do the fortunes of the Divine Comedy revive? Well, I think it's generally agreed that it's when we get to the Romantic era that things begin to hot up. And what appeals, it seems, to the Romantics is the intensity of the passion that is shown, especially in the Inferno. And so there is an early-ish romantic illustration. And a friend of mine recently completed an art history diploma, and he was told this is a key painting. This is where the romantic style really takes hold and displacing classicism in French painting. So there Dante and Virgil are crossing the river into the Inferno. So we'll see a lot of that, the romantic sort of identification with these extreme passions. This is just a few years after 1802. 1802, the first complete English translation was produced. And of course, it's beginning of the period of the Victorian Gothic fad and this sort of coupled with Romanticism. And that translation, of course, was carried by Keats on his walk north to the lakes and Scotland. So pretty much contemporary with Delacroix, we've got Blake, and so there are his simoniacs plunged into the fiery pits very effectively. And there's an interesting connection there, I think, with Jesmond history. Very much the same time, Richard Burden Sanderson, who was a key figure in the early history of Jesmond, he was working for Lord Eldon. So Lord Eldon was his uncle and had installed him in a very cushy little job where effectively he was taking bribes for dishing out church appointments. And Richard Burden Sanderson had a tremendous crisis of conscience. and packed the job in and basically complete and utter sort of U-turn, and distanced himself from Eldon, who was very upset by this. I mean, Eldon, of course, was a good old Tory, and he accepted the system as it was, warts and all, whereas Richard Burden Sanderson became a zealot. So when Blake is satirizing, or when he's illustrating this class of sinners, this isn't just an antiquarian thing. This is a live issue in the Church of England. How worldly should the Church of England be? And of course, Burden Sanderson abandons it altogether, sets up his own church here in Jesmond. So here's another local reference, and you can see Paolo and Francesca in Wallington. And Paolo and Francesca, I think, are key figures for the Romantics, because this is the passion which breaks the rules. This is why they're condemned, because Paolo and Francesca are not married to each other. She, in fact, is married to his brother, the rather horrible sounding Giovanni Malatesta of Rimini. And she begins an affair, and that affair, according to Dante, begins over a romantic poem, a book about Sir Lancelot. And so this sort of image of passion transcending all boundaries is a key one for the Romantics, and one which many of them pick up. I think it's also interesting that this was bought by Walter Calverley-Trevelyan at the Great Exhibition in 1851. So he went there many, many times, and this is one of the things he brought back. And I think it has, another significance possibly for him, that he and Pauline were really brought together by books. So it's more perhaps the bookish side of it which would appeal to him. They're intensely literary and learned pair. This, of course, is not how Dante sees Paolo and Francesca. He sees them being whirled around in a wind, a fiery wind, which represents their passion. And this is one of the brilliant ways in which he makes the punishment fit the crime, that those who have been whirled away by passion have to suffer that forevermore, this constantly buffeted and blown around. And actually, if you want a really good expression of what Dante saw, you need to turn to the Hunt Emerson book, so the cartoon book. You get this tremendous cartoonish sense of whirling and zooming, which of course could come straight out of Dennis the Menace or something like that. So there we are for the Romantics, the role models that they pick up from Dante. And I mean, one last thing on that, Ernest Dowson, who of course is a late Romantic poet, he coined this famous line. He said, "I have forgot thee, I have gone with the wind." And that, of course, is where we get our title, Gone with the Wind. And I'm sure that when he writes, but this is my guess anyway, that when he writes, "I've gone with the wind," he's thinking of that wind, the wind that blows the passionate around, the wind of their passions. So the most famous illustrator, probably, of Dante is Gustave Doré. And not really long after very much the same time as the Great Exhibition. Different style altogether, of course. So a young French artist, he planned to make his fortune by illustrating the great classics of European literature. And he started with Dante. So no one would give him an advance, and no publisher would support it. So he published the Inferno himself, and it was a great success. So I have to say, I do find these drawings quite difficult to interpret, but on the left, you can see the envious crawling up the mountain of purgatory. So in life, the envious were always coveting their neighbour's ass and whatever else. They were eyeing up their other people's possessions. So their reparation for that is that their eyes are wired shut, that they are blind, and they have to feel their way up the mountain. Just a reminder, of course, that purgatory is very, very different from hell. Those in hell have not repented. They will be punished forever and ever. Those in purgatory have sinned, but they have repented. And eventually they will get to the top of purgatory. And the top of purgatory is the Garden of Eden, which is a sort of launching pad from which they will go to heaven. So the mood in purgatory, although there is suffering, there is also hope. And in hell, of course, there is no hope. So the scene on the right is from hell. And again, another famous sinner, Farinata, who was an Epicurean. So he believed only in the body. He thought there was no such thing as the soul. And he's being punished really as a constant reminder of his body, that he's being constantly burned in an iron grave full of flames. So the style is a bit like sort of Hammer horror in a way, and these become very, very popular in magic lantern shows. And in about 1881, a 15-year-old boy saw these magic lantern slides, the Doré illustrations, in Monroe, Wisconsin. And almost immediately, he was changed from being a schoolboy into a young artist. And appropriately enough, his name was Art Young. So he goes on to create his own version of the Inferno. So there it is. And Art Young has a sort of socialist take on the thing. He satirizes the Inferno as capitalism, basically. And so you're welcome to hell. And it's run on business lines, which in a way sort of echoes what I think Sean O'Brien said last week, that the Inferno is a great factory for producing suffering. So that this Art Young's Inferno was republished quite recently. I mean, it's huge swathe of stuff being printed this year, more illustrations, more translations, it goes on and on. In terms of bringing Dante to life, I think in a way this is possibly one of the most exciting things for me, that the Ulysses canto, which is in the Inferno, many people's favorite part of the whole Divine Comedy. And it was particularly loved by Primo Levi. And in his famous book, If This Is a Man, he recounts a particular incident. So he's in Auschwitz, and one of the jobs which gives a tiny bit of relief from life in Auschwitz is being sent to fetch the food. And of course the food is horrible, and you know, they're all malnourished. But he and a young Frenchman are sent to fetch the food, which just gives them a few minutes where they're on their own and they're carrying these sort of horrible slop pans across the compound. And they managed to have a few minutes of conversation. And they spoke about the Ulysses canto. So Ulysses, condemned to hell, of course, as a pagan, he has to be in hell, he can't be anywhere else, but in particular condemned for his slippery tongue, the wily Odysseus, as the Greeks call him. The wiliness is not a virtue, it is in Dante's eyes deception and treachery. And yet, in spite of that, Ulysses speaks beautifully and plainly in this canto, and he addresses the men on his ship, and he says, and my Italian is so terrible, I'm just going to have to translate it. He says, "Consider who you are and where you came from. You were not made to live like beasts, but to follow virtue and knowledge." And so Primo Levi had memorized much of this canto, in particular those lines, and I really have an extraordinary sort of resonance for someone living in Auschwitz. You know, you were not made to live like beasts. And this was one of the things that kept him going, memorizing and repeating those lines to himself. And of course, he did survive. So, still in the Inferno, I mean, this is just to show a completely different approach. One of the things which recently, I think it was Sean O'Brien who said this actually on the radio, he said that the thing which appeals to the modernists typically about Dante, in particular Eliot and Pound and Yeats, is his sense of order, you know, that this is an ordered world. Completely the opposite in a way of the Romantics, who seem to like the passion, the unbridled passion. But here we have a modernist who's really, you know, out on his own, I suppose, as Dalì always is. So a very, very sort of odd style of illustration. And I actually saw these illustrations in Cannes a few years ago on holiday. I had no idea they existed until then. He was commissioned by the Italian government, which is an odd thing for them to do. They later took the commission away. Possibly they weren't happy with what he had done. And as we said, Dante particularly hated treachery and dishonesty. And probably because he felt as though his exile from Florence was the result of deception and lies and treachery. So it actually is lower down in hell than murder. The bottom levels of hell are all about treachery. And it's probably an offense against reason as well. You know, the power of speech is what makes us human. And to abuse that power of speech by speaking falsely is kind of the worst sin. It's abusing what is most essential about us, about our nature. So quite low down in hell, we've got this really quite small time crook, Gianni Schicchi, who impersonated an acquaintance who was either on his deathbed or dead. I can't remember which, but anyway, he climbed into a bed and pretended to be a dying man, where he dictated a nuncupative will. And of course, that will left money to Gianni Schicchi, needless to say. So he's given a strange punishment, doesn't quite fit the crime. He zooms around hell, biting the other sinners. And so there he is, biting away. Of course, very famous opera based on that by Puccini. So here we have Hunt Emerson, and there's his version of the corrupt clergyman with their heads in the fiery pits. And as I mentioned, I think there are affinities between cartoon illustration and Dante. And Kevin Jackson, on his radio show, on the radio show I referred to, said there are two things in particular: the extreme compressed character. So some of Dante's narration is incredibly compressed, as cartoon illustration is, and also the excessiveness that what you get in the Inferno is things which are just way over the top in a way that Dennis the Menace and Minnie the Minx and everybody else is. So it is actually quite a good fit, and I do recommend this book. It's not just a laugh. It does seriously engage with the text, and it shows you things, frankly, that it made sense of things to me that other illustrations and other glosses didn't. So we've got to Flaxman, and so John Flaxman was a very precocious and distinguished student at the Royal Academy, won the silver medal. He worked for Wedgwood Pottery, branched out into grave monuments, and with the money he'd earned, he travelled to Rome, which of course was a very, very popular thing to do in those days. They intended to stay 2 years, he and his wife, but in fact they stayed for 7 years. And while he was there, one of the reasons he could stay there was because he started winning commissions in Rome. So first of all, from Georgiana Hare Naylor to illustrate the Iliad and the Odyssey. Very, very successful. She was a cousin of the Duchess of Devonshire and also an artist. She also actually acquired the copyrights to those drawings, so she wasn't entirely being disinterested. She did probably a good piece of business there. The illustration for Dante came from Thomas Hope, who was a banker and also an art lover. So that's relative, well, sort of in the middle period of his career, I would say. He comes back to London, and he's mainly famous as a sculptor, very, very successful sculptor, becomes a professor at the Royal Academy. And the sort of thing he does, well, there is his monument to Nelson. And of course, few people are going to have much affection for that kind of work nowadays. But he's a very, very prominent figure. Probably, I mean, I don't want to say he's forgotten, but you know, he's kind of perhaps suffered in comparison with somebody contemporary like Blake, for instance. But Flaxman was a tremendous influence on many European artists, especially those French sort of neoclassicists of that period, but also Goya. And I'm just going to read a little piece here from a write-up on an exhibition at the Royal Academy. His international renown was not based on his primary career as a sculptor, but on the numerous illustrations he drew in Rome. When circulated as engravings, their effect on European art was profound. Flaxman's figures and graphic style can be found in the paintings of David and Ingres, William Blake, Goya, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and in the superheroes of Stan Lee's Marvel Comics. Goethe said the illustrations made Flaxman the idol of all the dilettanti. And Thackeray admitted that when he wrote the scene in Vanity Fair, in which Becky Sharp dresses as Clytemnestra, it was Flaxman's depiction he had in mind. He developed a style that both caught and defined the classical revival at its peak. Flaxman pared his designs even further back until they were two-dimensional friezes. They exemplified the core principle of neoclassicism. True art should express noble simplicity and calm grandeur. So that's what you're going to get in Flaxman's illustrations, very different from Blake and Delacroix, even though, in fact, Flaxman and Blake were friends, as we'll see in a minute. So there we have Paolo and Francesca. They are being buffeted, and so there is truth to the text here. So you can see them leaning into that wind, but admittedly in a very sort of, well, in a way which has noble simplicity and calm grandeur. And we also see Dante there swooning, that at this stage of the Inferno, he's still very soft-hearted, and he is still moved by the sufferings of those he sees. So he faints at this great narration by Francesca of her story. Later on, he becomes a bit tougher, and in fact, he's encouraged to be so. That, you know, this is the will of God, so don't argue with it. So that's one from the Inferno. Here's Flaxman on Purgatory. And I suppose you get a bit of a superhero element there. This is Lucifer. Lucifer does not actually appear in the Purgatory. This is an illustration. So in Purgatory, on the wall of the mountain, there are these carved reliefs, which is what Flaxman is reproducing. And so another sort of parallel that might come to mind is Blake. So they were roughly contemporaries. Flaxman perhaps a little bit older. He was a year or two ahead of Blake at the Academy. And he was a great supporter of Blake's career and a great friend. And Blake said, this is in a letter to Flaxman, he says, "You, oh dear Flaxman, are a sublime archangel, my friend and companion from eternity." It's Flaxman who is the senior figure of the two, obviously, in terms of taste at the time. So finally, here is Flaxman illustrating Paradise. And he's talking to his semi-mythical ancestor, Cacciaguida, who was apparently knighted on crusade by the Holy Roman Emperor. And Cacciaguida gets a lot of room in the text. A lot of it is a sort of very sort of conservative rant about how standards have fallen and Florence is no longer the simple industrious place it was, and so on and so on. And frankly, he's often a bit of a bore. But he does have interesting things to say about Dante's exile, which are often repeated. I must say, one of those wonderful coincidences that happens when you do these talks, quite coincidentally, as I was writing this bit, I was poking through some old stuff in the house, and I came upon a newspaper article recording my grandfather's retirement after 50 years working on the railways. And it kind of put the thing into perspective for me, because it made me realize that although Cacciaguida seems an unsympathetic character, the urge to revere one's ancestors is a very strong one. And I suppose the same sort of feelings that I had about my grandfather, he had about Cacciaguida.
Right. So thank you, Keith. Excellent stuff, particularly about Flaxman, about which I didn't know. And I didn't know about Art Young either. That was completely new to me. I must definitely look into that more.
Right.
On that note, I will remind you that the Lit and Phil is an educational charity. We rely on our members, and we also rely on donations. So this talk has been free, but if you felt inclined, and I hope you would, then we would certainly welcome a donation towards the cost of future talks. You can do that by looking at our website, and there are clear links there. And when this talk goes online in a day or two, there will be a note under the talk and at the end of the video exactly how you can make donations. So thank you to everybody, and good night.